Welcome back to Monday Musings, a casual conversation about culture and theology. I'm Justin Ely.
And I'm Daniel Chen. We're just a couple guys talking about some stuff.
We have been talking about a biblical theology on race for 7 different parts. This is part 7 of a biblical theology on race. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've grown in your understanding of how the storyline of Scripture, creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, informs how we view race and ethnicity. Last week we critiqued Christian nationalism, and today is a long-awaited day. We are critiquing critical race theory. So put your helmets on. Buckle up.
I mean, I feel like I keep asking myself this question, like, how much do normal, just everyday life people follow stuff like this? I know me and you are just like in the trenches with this.
Yeah, I'm not sure unless you're like a cultural apologist or you have a passion for politics. Or your kid came home from their school and they were like, "Mommy, Daddy, I was told that I was an oppressor this week today."
Right.
What's an oppressor? Otherwise, I'm not sure it's forefront of your mind.
Right. For sure.
Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. But at the very least today, we hope to give you kind of a solid definition of what it is and what to look out for.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get into the seriousness, we start with the life hack.
So the life hack this week, I don't know if it can, I guess it's a life hack, but I think it will be helpful.
Oh, it's a life hack.
The life hack is it's time to change your filters.
Change your filters, people. Stop being filthy.
It's time to change your air filters. I actually don't. Do you know how often you're supposed to do it? Is it like 3 months, 6 months? I do mine 6 months.
I think it's either every 3 or every 6.
I've heard. I have a Nest in it. I have it set on it, like tells me when to change
genius.
it. But it told me to change it like a month ago, but I knew I was going to change it like a month after a month from a month ago, which is now. And so I kind of ignored it. But it was like kind of nice to know, like, because I think the way Nest works, it's a run time. After it runs for a certain amount of hours,
sure,
it's time to change the filter. But man, I'm glad I changed it, man. It was
nasty.
It was pretty. My filters were pretty gross. So
yeah, I'm glad for the reminder because I had it on my calendar last week to do, and I didn't do it. So here we are.
Man, it's funny like learning to be adult. When I first got married,
right,
because I rented up until I got married. And the first year we got married, we still rented, but I was just supposed to change the filters. I didn't change the filters that year, and I didn't change the filters for the first 2 years we were married because there was no one told me to.
Yeah.
And that was I was explaining to the youth yesterday. I was like, I run the youth group. I was like, you're going to become an adult one day, and then you're going to realize you have some major gaps in knowledge of how to be an adult, live your life, and that's okay. You know,
changing filters.
I had to ask my wife, can I use this pen to write on these name tags? And she's she looked at me like I was an idiot. And I was like,
no, Daniel.
Well, she was like, yeah, yeah, of course that'll work. It's a normal pen and a name tag. And I'm like,
I'm just checking.
Do you know when the last time I wrote on a name tag was? I can't even remember.
Right.
So I was like, I have an actual gap in my knowledge of how to,
Just name tag writing.
Yeah. So I haven't handwritten anything in forever. I never handwrite anything. So.
Well, there you go, America. Change your air filters.
Change your air filters. Breathe easier.
Breathe better.
Yeah, breathe better.
Our second segment today is our Book of the Month segment. This month, I'm going to go with an oldie but a goodie, a classic, Desiring God by John Piper.
All right, yeah.
Desiring God by John Piper is a fantastic book. It really goes back to the cornerstone of what's been his ministry for so many years. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him.
Right.
So I would highly recommend giving it a read.
Yeah, I think I know as a younger believer, it was pretty foundational in my understanding. I feel like it helped open my eyes to seeing God in a more real way than, I don't know, what I got in Sunday school, youth group, even college ministry type stuff. It is a hard read though. So just
it's
it's
gonna take some effort.
Yeah. It'll stretch your mind in a good way.
Yes. So that's my book of the month. What's yours?
Mine is called Evangelism in a Skeptical World by Sam
Fantastic.
Chan.
Fantastic.
Maybe
Great book.
Sam Chan, Asian guy from Australia.
Yep, Asian guy with an Australian accent.
It might be called Evangelism in a Lockdown World now. If you've been,
Let the reader understand. Listener.
if you've been following the news,
Whoops.
you'll get that joke. If you don't, well, I don't know. Look it up on the Googles. And but Evangelism in a Skeptical World, probably one of the most practically helpful books on evangelism I've ever read. And
It's really good.
I've read quite a few.
Yeah.
I think it just, what is the content we are using in evangelism? It's always the same. It's always the gospel. But what is the package that we use? That changes.
Yes.
Right. And so for a long time, we teach a couple here at our church, 3 circles and bridge diagram, or, maybe you were in Crew and you did something like 4 spiritual laws.
Mm-hmm.
The gospel is the gospel. As long as you get the gospel out, I'm not too concerned about how you share the gospel,
Sure.
as long as the gospel is being shared. But I do think there's just practically like ways that are more effective in different cultures and in different times. And now
absolutely.
that times and culture have changed in the past 30 years, this is a really helpful book to how to share the gospel with skeptical or postmodern world. And so if that's where
really
you
good.
live, which most
really
of
good.
you probably do, it's just really helpful.
Yeah.
It's very practical. Lots of
Highly
stories, easy to read.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, well, we're going to get into it. Today we're going to be offering a critique of critical race theory, as we've used our biblical theology on race to go through creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Now we're using that, kind of synthesizing that. First we critiqued Christian nationalism last week. Now we're critiquing critical race theory this week. And we want to begin by talking about what CRT is not, in a similar way we did last week by saying what Christian nationalism is not. So to begin with, CRT first is not a belief in racism.
Yeah. I feel like I'm like, how am I even supposed to explain this? Because it seems so
Basic.
basic.
But
And what we're saying is, if someone says there's racism, you shouldn't point at it and be like, CRT.
You're a critical race theorist.
The reason we have to say that is because there's a lot of CRT finger pointing right now.
A lot.
And don't get me wrong, we are against CRT, right?
Mm-hmm.
This idea of CRT, but not everything is CRT. And I think what's been confusing is the more we point the finger as everything is CRT, nothing becomes CRT, and it becomes really confusing.
Right.
So
We've used a statement, not everything is CRT and not everything is racism.
right,
But some things are CRT and some things are racism.
right,
So, yeah. So CRT is not a belief in racism. Secondly, CRT is not a belief in structural or systemic racism, meaning, and this is one of the pieces of the conversation I think have been really unhelpful, is the way it's been posed now is to believe in CRT is to believe in structural racism, and to not believe in CRT is to not believe in structural racism. And what I mean by structural racism, again, you have to define everything, is that systems can be built to promote a racist ideology or preference or bias.
right.
And so for some reason, and we went through when we were going through the doctrine of the fall, that because we're fallen as sinners, we can build systems on our sin.
Right.
An example of that would be chattel-based slavery, Jim Crow laws. So we gave some examples of systemic racism.
Right.
You don't need CRT
You look
to
at
believe
Jim
it.
Crow laws and you say that is systemic racism.
Right.
Right. That's,
And you don't need CRT to come to
Right.
that conclusion.
And here's the confusing thing. The problem with CRT, and we're going to get into this, the problem with CRT is that if you hold to that, you say, if you believe you're oppressed, all your problems are because of a systemic oppression against you.
Right.
And I think that's why there's kind of this pushback that no, there's no systemic racism, but really people are pushing back against CRT.
Right.
But you can push back against CRT and acknowledge that there have been and there could still be systemic racism built into the system that you're currently in. Because I know we're not all in the same place. I won't say definitively that it's everywhere for everyone. But, but to say that you can spot systemic racism doesn't make you a, what do you call people?
Critical race theorist?
Yeah, critical race theorist.
An advocate of CRT?
A CRTer?
A CRTite, I believe. A CRTian.
A
Cretan.
I like CRTN.
A CRTian.
Yeah, that's not a word, but
it is now.
Yeah, sure thing.
We just made it.
We live in a postmodern world where anything can be
a word
anything.
if I want
Yeah,
to.
so for sure.
So it's not believing in CRT isn't believing in racism, and not believing in CRT is not believing in racism or structural systemic racism. The other thing, I think CRT is not a belief that America has committed some horrific racial sins. And what I mean by that is you can believe America has committed some horrific racial sins because we have, and also really disagree with CRT.
Sure.
I think one of the unfortunate other things about this conversation has been somehow if you have problems with CRT, you're like, you want to deny that there was slavery in this country or that we did horrible things. And it's like, no, you can disagree with CRT and believe that America committed some really horrific racial sins.
Yeah, and you know, it just goes back to you don't have to ignore the bad parts of history, but you also shouldn't let the bad parts of history define your identity and how you live your life, right? It's like, I know we've been saying this the whole time we've been doing this podcast, really, that we all lean towards extremes. And I think it's just helpful in a lot of circumstances to be aware of that and try not to lean towards those extremes, right? The extremes here being none of that happened, which to me, I'm like, come on, like just read any history book,
right?
You know?
Right.
But some people take it way too far and say what happened in the past defines me today, and I think that's not helpful either. So,
yeah. So a lot of times when the conversation of CRT comes up, you might hear someone say, "Well, yeah, I believe in CRT," and you go, "Okay, well, why? Why? I mean, I believe racism is real, and I think it can be systemic, and I think America has done some really racist things in the past." And what we're saying is, we actually agree with you on all three of those points, but that's not what CRT is.
Right.
So I think it's important to define things. So what is CRT? Well, a few different problems here. It depends on who you ask. There really are a variety of definitions. I mean, this really took root in America in the form of legal studies. And we are not CRT scholars. So we just want to say that up front. We also don't have enough time in this podcast to adequately talk about the origins of CRT and how it arose out of a cultural Marxist kind of framework out of the Frankfurt School.
Right.
We're going to give you some resources in the show notes to do that digging yourself.
Right.
It's a helpful background. I think for us, we want to mainly get through like what are the main tenets of CRT right now,
right,
and talk about those. But knowing where it came from, I mean that's a whole nother conversation,
right?
But we're not going to get into it. We're not CRT scholars,
and we will use some phrases that will define that come from some of this background. But once again, we live in a postmodern world where nothing can be everything and everything can be nothing, and so nothing is nothing, and it's very confusing. And what happens is that applies to language too now in our culture, where you can just define anything any way you want, but it's not helpful, right? And so I think, once again, like if you've thrown out the term cultural Marxist, do you know what that means? Because you may be right, you may be wrong, but if we're throwing out CRT, cultural Marxism, let's know what historically that has meant and what that means now. so that we can actually use these phrases properly.
Correctly. Yep.
And so once again, I would highly, highly suggest to research the cultural Marxism in the Frankfurt School.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, as I think about even what am I looking out for just practically as I look into public schools and
Mm-hmm.
voting and what politicians are doing and what people are calling for, I can now better throw out what is just noise and really just take in what do I actually need to be looking at here, looking out for. Yeah. And so we're going to hit some of these terms a little later, but it will really be helpful, in my opinion, for you to research that, because it's not happening it's not in every school or anything, but it is happening in some places. And the cultural Marxist stuff. And, I would suggest be aware as a Christian, just be aware of if that's happening. Yeah. And don't be afraid of it if it's not happening.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, that's good. So we're using Neil Shenvi's definition of critical race theory. Neil Shenvi has spent a lot of time researching this. He is a genius. He's like a chemist or something crazy.
Oh, really?
Really smart guy.
Is he part of Mensa?
I don't know. Yeah, he's just super flippin' smart. So Neil Shenvi has spent a lot of time researching critical race theory. He's dealt with a lot of the primary sources, which again we're going to cite in our show notes for you to go and look at. But he's given a 6-part definition of critical race theory that I think is really helpful. We're going to share the definition, and then we're going to critique. So we'll share the definition, explain it if we need to, and then share. So this is all from Neil Shenvi. I'm literally quoting his definition here. It'll be in the show notes. Number 1, what is critical race theory?
Before you start, I think something that will be interesting to look out for too is what makes this even just an added layer of complexity to something like CRT is that you may know some people that hold to a couple of these, but not all of them.
Sure.
And that makes it confusing. So as you're listening to these, just be aware, what are the more prominent ones that you are seeing? Mm-hmm. And let's not overreact either way.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But so, and most people, unless you've been trained as in this, most people as they're reading and they're reading online probably hold to some of these, but not all.
Sure. So part 1, number 1, 6-part definition. Individual identity is inseparable from group identity. Number 2, the power of oppressor groups rests not in the group's size, but in the fact that it dictates society's norms and expectations. So just pause there for a second. So what CRT often says, it divides people largely into the oppressed and the oppressor.
Right.
And that's it. Those are the two main groups of society. Whether or not you're in a certain group actually has nothing to do with how much money you make, how well off you are, what has actually happened in your life, your personal experiences. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with which is the group that sets the norms in society. So what CRT is going to say is white, cisgender, Christian males set the norms for society. So anyone who's not that, if you're not white, if you're not cisgender, which means you're a man that likes a woman or a woman that likes a man, if you're not a male or you're not a Christian, anything that's not that is going to be some subcategory in the oppressed category. Regardless, you could be a black transgender billionaire, but according to CRT, you are still oppressed.
Right.
Because you don't belong to the dominant group.
And that is called the hegemony.
Right.
Yeah. So if you hear the word, which I don't know why most of our listeners would have heard that word, but if you ever do, if you hear the word hegemony, that's what it's talking about.
Right. So So what this is saying, right? Number one, individual identity is inseparable from group identity. So who you are as a person is less important than which group you belong to.
Right.
We're grouped by our race, our sexual preference, our gender, self-identification, our religion or irreligion, right? All of these things. And being a part of that group is more important in defining you and your experience than your actual personal experience.
Right. And if you've heard people say, which I've read this online and all this stuff, I guess I've never heard anyone say it out loud in person because I guess, I don't know, people are more confident behind a keyboard, I think.
Of course.
But if you ever heard like all white people are racist and black people can't be racist, that's where this
idea comes from.
So if you're wondering like, where is that coming from? It's coming from this idea of hegemony that it doesn't matter, Justin, what you have done or what you believe. You're part of the hegemony. You're part of, and that's what your identity is.
Right.
And I'm part of this oppressed thing, oppressed group. And so I can't be racist because racism is only a power dynamic from top down.
Correct. And because I'm at the bottom, defined not by my actual life, but by this group I'm supposed to be a part of. Therefore, I cannot be. Yeah.
So if you're wondering, yes, this is different than what you know and have heard racism is in the past, but we're going to get to that in point 5. So I'll finish my thought there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Okay, so number 1, individual identity is inseparable from group identity. Number 2, the power of oppressor groups rests not in the group's size, but in the fact that it dictates society's norms and expectations. Again, this is from Neil Shenvi. Number 3, our primary duty as human beings is to work for the liberation of oppressed groups, either by resisting hegemonic power, if we ourselves are part of an oppressed group, or by eschewing our power in standing in solidarity as a, quote, ally of the oppressed, if we are members of the oppressor group. So you've seen this a lot kind of in our kind of racial discussions, right, is what we really need to do in society. And this is where the real cultural Marxism piece comes into this that people are talking about, is we got to overthrow those who are in charge. Society, we can't just like slowly change things. If you think about like the U.S. Constitution, right, we have corrected wrongs over time.
Right.
You think even on the racial conversations, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, post-Civil War amendments, we've used the system to correct problems in the system.
Right.
But what CRT says is, no, you really need to blow up the system. And the only way you're going to do that is the oppressed group have to overthrow the oppressors.
Right. And so a few thoughts here. First of all, eschewing. I did not know that's how you said that word.
Oh, is it?
Oh, I don't know. You said it so confidently, and you
with
read
confidence.
a lot. Anyways, we're talking about the word that's spelled ESCHEWING. I literally read that word sometimes and do not know how to say it in my mind. And so, eschewing. Now I know.
Eschew.
Oh, well, if you just heard that was from Google.
Eschew.
Eschew. I think I said it right.
Yeah. Or is there CH like chew? I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, someone smarter than me tell me how to say this word.
Interesting. Okay.
But yeah, I think so. Once again, studying Marxism will be helpful in that Marxism tells you the proletariat and bourgeois is an economic power gap.
Right.
Right. So the proletariat, the people who don't have the money, overthrow the people who do have the money.
Right.
Cultural Marxism is the same idea, but
Applied
the
to
power
culture.
Yes, but the power is no longer economic, but who has the cultural power.
Right.
And so a lot of what the Frankfurt School of View look at it, the idea is to take over like universities and Hollywood and
Correct.
newspapers, and what you're seeing is these things happening, and that's why. And so the idea, and we'll hit on this maybe in the Q&A podcast, but the idea of like you have to be an ally, like that those terms, ally, anti-racist, is buying into kind of this CRT stuff because you can no longer just be against racism. You have to
be anti-racist.
You have to align with the oppressed power to overthrow the oppressors.
Right.
Right? Anything short of that, you're an enemy.
Now, the interesting thing about this definition number 3, and regular Marxism actually didn't get past this as well. We don't really know what would happen if number 3 actually happened.
Right.
So if the oppressed actually overthrew the oppressor, then by definition they would become the new oppressors.
Correct.
And someone else should overthrow them.
Yes.
So again, what you're seeing with this, like, with CRT in general, at its core, again, remember, individuals are holding varying levels of belief in this, even if you say you subscribe to CRT. But what Neil Shenvi is getting at is that at its core, it's always looking to just blow up the system, basically. Number 4, according to Neil Shenvi, lived experience is more important than objective evidence when it comes to understanding oppression. So what you can kind of see here sometimes in this conversation, when you try to bring up data, when you try to bring up, whether you're talking about police shootings or different things, if you try to bring up data, sometimes in this conversation that is kind of tossed away,
right,
and said, well, what we really need to be talking about are what are people's experiences,
right.
Now we'll get to this in a little bit. There's certainly nothing wrong with talking about people's experiences. We should listen to one another's experiences, but so that what CRT though is getting at its core is that someone's experience is equal to objective evidence,
right?
Even if their experience really runs counter to actual objective facts,
right? And they've replaced, and this is what happens in postmodernism, right? This is a direct result of postmodernism. Sure. That there is no objective truth except for my subjective experience.
Right.
That's what CRT is basing this off of.
Right.
Which, if you draw that to its logical conclusion, which I know you throw logic out when you when you accept postmodernism, but is everyone's right and everyone's wrong? So there's no right and wrong except for if I say you are wrong.
Right.
That's the only right. The only right is when I say you are wrong.
Yeah.
Right. This is what is happening here.
Here's kind of an example of where this would fall. A black guy is walking across the street, and an old white lady is walking toward him. The old white lady moves across the street to a different sidewalk when she's getting close to you, and you say, I know that was racism.
Right.
I'm positive that the reason she crossed the sidewalk was racism, because my experience and my life have taught me that's what that is. I am sure that, and the truth is maybe it was. It very well could have been.
Right.
But this kind of like, we take subjective experiences and we classify them under very like objective type of terms,
right,
and give them the same weight as facts and data.
Right.
It's kind of part of this.
I think where we see this most is the police stuff.
Correct.
Is where you see this most.
Right.
And I do think there are bad apples that are policemen.
Sure.
But I think what experience would tell most of the people who grew up in black communities is that all police are out to get them.
Correct.
And that just objectively can't be true.
Right.
But subjectively, it feels that way.
Sure.
Right. And so I think that's where you see this a lot.
Yep. That's number 4. Number 5, dominant groups conceal their bids for power under the guise of objectivity. So this is kind of the counterbalance to what we just said, right?
Right.
Which is like, you're just using facts to stay in power. That's what this is.
Right.
Number 5 is, your constant obsession with talking about the police issue by using data and statistics is just one way for you to hold on to your dominant position in society.
Right. And what's interesting too is, it gets confusing because when there are some black people who are also quote these facts and statistics, and they're cast aside as like part of the I can't say that word. Hegemonic power. Because it's like, what do you do with them? They don't fit your definitions anymore, but they're against you, so they're still the enemy.
Right.
But they're, and so, I just think this one is actually like, if you're trying to undermine a whole system, this is kind of a genius thing to attack in some ways.
Right, because if you say, well, your facts are a way to keep you in power, then
what, you can't use facts anymore?
Right.
And I think this is a huge problem with CRT, is that this allows you to, if you hold to this, convince yourself that facts and statistics don't matter. Right? If you start believing truth based on objectivity is a mechanic to hold power, then you can convince yourself of anything at that point. There's no truth. There's no basis for anything, right? And I think you do see that.
Yeah. Part 6 of the definition: the concept of intersectionality characterizes the ways in which people who are in multiple subordinate categories have an experience of oppression that is qualitatively different than those of any single subordinate group. So that's a mouthful. So part of CRT is this kind of subcategory of intersectionality. What intersectionality teaches is basically we have overlapping identities.
Right.
And you basically can add those up together to see how much of an oppressor you are or how oppressed you are.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't matter in this kind of thinking what your actual life is like. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't matter what kind of house you grew up in. That doesn't matter.
Right.
It matters the overlapping pieces of identity. So if you are a white, male, Protestant, cisgender person, you are at the very top of dominance.
You are
the hegemony. You're the hegemony of the hegemony.
Yeah.
If you are a woman, okay, that's a point away.
If you are a transgender, black, Jewish woman in a wheelchair, you
are at the height of
the intersectional oppressed.
Right. What intersectionality is saying is all of those kind of different categories come together to form this identity. So that's kind of a piece of how, critical race theory is going to define the oppressed and the oppressors according to intersectionality. So that's kind of the 6-part definition.
And I would just say where you see this, not just even in race, but you have seen the LGBT community, for example, continue to cry that they're oppressed, when if you look at who's actually getting canceled, I don't know how you can make the claim anymore, right? But what you'll see is continual call for oppression, not because of actual oppression anymore, but because they fit this intersectional model.
Correct.
And because they're still not cisgendered, male, whatever, they're still being oppressed, even if there's no actual documented oppression going on, even if people aren't out to get them.
Right. Again, I mean, this is what's important here is what actually happens in your personal life, according to CRT, is actually less important than the group you are perceived to belong to,
right?
And how much that group is perceived to have power or not have power,
right?
So if you are a white Protestant cisgender male, but you grew up in a family on food stamps, your parents were divorced, you had a bad education, all this stuff, that actually doesn't matter according to this theory. But because you still belong to the hegemonic power group,
right?
So that is the definition of CRT that we are critiquing. Again, maybe you have a different definition. That's fine. Maybe you understand things differently. That's fine. Again, this is a pretty complex, even the biggest proponents of CRT, they have to write like a 300-page book about it to describe it. So again, this is not the easiest thing in the world to do a less than 1 hour podcast to define it and critique it. So we would ask for your charity if you feel like some of these definitions are unfair. We'd ask for your charity in, we're kind of going with Neil Shenvi's definition. We're trusting his. We're going to post again his dealing with primary sources, which is really helpful. But you have to critique something, so you have to define something.
And I would say this is the general one. When you see in the news, parents at school board are protesting CRT, this is the definition they are protesting.
Right.
So if you're like, why are these parents protesting CRT, and you hold a different definition of CRT that is not this, you might be really confused, right? But what we're saying is this is the generally accepted one when people are afraid of this being taught in CRT being taught in schools.
This is what they're talking about.
This is the one they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're using this definition.
For sure.
So if you hold to a different one, then it's a whole different discussion.
Right.
But this is the one that is culturally being accepted right now as a whole, in general. And so, and I just want to mention too, I've heard a lot of people ask, how can someone think, a certain way about police or whatever? But I'm like, if you view this definition, I can totally see how someone can get there, right?
Of course.
And so worldviews are so important to understand before even having a conversation with someone else. It's discovering what worldview are you coming from.
Sure.
Yeah.
So now we want to offer a critique of CRT, and we're going to use our same categories that we've done throughout the series, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And so some of this is from us. Some of this is thanks to John Stonestreet at Breakpoint Ministries in the Colson Center. We'll also have his link in the show notes.
I feel like John Stonestreet is such a great name. You think you'd be more well known as a pastor if you were Justin Stonestreet or something?
I mean, I think our church would be at least 5 times bigger. Maybe 6.
Yeah, and this podcast would have 1 million listeners.
Least,
yeah,
minimum. Yeah, the real question for John Stonestreet, if you're listening out there, is that really your name? Were you really born Stonestreet? I don't know. It's a conveniently good name.
Yeah.
It's almost as good of a name as Ron Burgundy. It almost seems too good to be true. So John Stonestreet has been a help with this. He really is a great thinker. I'd encourage you to read him. So first, Doctrine of Creation. Our critique on CRT is that CRT sees people more as belonging to separate classes and races or groups, even though CRT does correctly acknowledge that race is a human construct. That's a plus. But it sees people more belonging to groups that are different than it does as seeing the commonality of all human beings being made in the image of God.
Right.
So instead of starting with, we're both people.
Right.
We're both made in the image of God.
And have value and worth.
Right.
Yeah.
It starts with, I'm oppressed, you're an oppressor, not because of anything you've ever done, but because of some random group you're supposedly belong to.
Yeah, and we said in the fall podcast that othering is a result of sin, and this entire worldview is based on a result of sin. And that's where it starts.
It starts with othering.
Yes, it starts with othering.
We're othering starts in Genesis 3 in the biblical worldview. In CRT, that's foundational to its definition. Othering is a foundational piece of it.
Right. And it's interesting because there's, once again, in CRT, in this definition, there's no there's no unity. Unity is
it's
such
not
a
possible.
guise. Yeah, because it's about overthrowing.
Because even if you subjectively overthrow, then the cycle would just repeat again.
It keeps repeating. Yeah.
So doctrine of creation is an important place to start. So seeing people in their commonality as image bearers of God. But prompts the CRT for correctly saying race is a human construct, and that's what we said. The Bible teaches that there is one race, the human race, and everything else is ethnicity. But seeing people belonging to groups rather than seeing them made in the image of God is our critique for creation. Second, doctrine of the fall. CRT incorrectly teaches that oppressors are guilty and the oppressed are not. But the biblical worldview says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God.
Right.
Whether you are black, whether you are white, whether you're Hispanic, whether you are Asian, you have sinned and are guilty.
Right.
It also incorrectly passes on sin based on a skin color. So I inherit a certain kind of sin because I may be white.
Right.
Even if your ancestors were from Sweden or something, you still somehow inherit this racial sin.
Right.
And Scripture teaches that every human being stands before God to hold account to what you have done.
Right.
So the doctrine of the fall, this is where CRT I think really gets off.
Right.
Is it creates basically angels and demons out of society.
Right.
Not really based on anything you've done, but again, this kind of group that you supposedly belong to.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know there's a few. I have multiple friends that go to a few different churches around the Atlanta area that, not fully, but some of the pastors have preached out of some of this. Mm-hmm. And one of the comments that I've heard that's similar with all these people going to a few different churches is, I just feel guilty all the time.
Right.
Well, why do you think that is?
Yeah.
If you hold to this and you are white, no matter what you have done, you are guilty.
Yeah.
That's what
Yep.
it says. And if you are in the oppressed group, you are not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
You are righteous. Mm-hmm. And that is antithetical to the gospel narrative,
right?
In the biblical narrative,
right?
Yeah.
Now, I will say, two things that I want to be as fair as possible. I think that this concept of intersectionality really gives a bad doctrine of humanity and a bad doctrine of the fall. But I do think it can be a helpful way to get into someone else's shoes. Sure. So I would say, in kind of critiquing this view, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think the idea of
don't overcorrect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A black transgender woman in a wheelchair, right? That kind of example that you gave, according to CRT, basically can't be with sin, essentially, because she's at the very bottom of the oppressed group. So we'd say that's a bad doctrine of the fall. But at the same time, right, let's just be honest here. Me, white male, cisgender, Protestant, whatever, I do have a very different experience in life than that woman. And if I want to love her as my neighbor, getting into her shoes would be a good place to start. We actually see this in the scriptures. This was pointed out to me. I think I heard D.A. Horton say this. When you get to John 4, the woman at the well.
Right.
She was a woman. She was a social outcast, which is why the text points out that she went at noon to get water when you usually go in the morning. She had been divorced and remarried 5 times, right? So you do see in John 4, there are these overlapping parts of, you could say, her identity that help you understand her as a person.
Right.
And understand how Jesus' words to her were just so incredible.
Right.
So I'm saying, I think it's a really bad doctrine of the fall. It's a really bad doctrine of humanity to establish someone's identity that way. And at the same time, I think you could learn to step in someone else's shoes and through compassion help understand where they're coming from, and I don't think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I think you can critique and be compassionate.
Yeah.
Shocker.
Right.
But once again, we lean towards extremes and we overcorrect, right? So you could say intersectionality as a way of defining your identity is wrong, right? But you don't have to throw out experiences if they've experienced hurts. You can still be compassionate and listen and understand, right? And so, I think a good way to see this in some ways is like, I don't see my identity as like Asian guy, you know what I mean? Or like non-white guy. But we went to a barbecue restaurant recently up in North Georgia.
Yep.
And remember what I said to you?
I do.
I said, I'm really glad I'm here with a group of white guys right now, because me and one of our elders were the only non-white people there.
Right.
And both you and our other friend John were like, oh yeah, I never thought, never thought of that. And here's the thing. It would be wrong for me to say everyone here is racist.
Correct.
It would be wrong to say there are people here that are racist against me. That's also wrong. But I think it does give you some sort of compassion that I even have to think about it.
Right.
Because I have experienced it before.
Right.
So I'm not saying my experiences I can project onto other people and say everyone is like this other this other person who was racist against me.
Yep.
But because of my experience, I now am thinking about that. It's affected me in the way I see the world.
Yes.
And that gives you some sort of compassion to be able to understand me a little bit better and to put yourself in my shoes, something you've never had to think about before. I think that's what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
You once again, it'd be wrong for me to just assume all these things about the people that were at this barbecue restaurant because all the people who served us were incredibly nice and whatever. And the old white couple next to us was like joking with me, and it was great. And so it would be super wrong for me to take this standpoint and say, because I am intersectionally different than everyone else here, they must be out to get me. But I was more aware of the way I was different because I've experienced negativity because of that difference before that you have not experienced. And that's what we're talking about. But most people who are against CRT would say, I should not have thought like that.
Right. And I would say, as the white guy, sorry to use my intersectionality here, I would say it's a way for me to love you as my brother, to be aware that you feel that. Yeah.
Another
thing I'd kind of say under the doctrine of the fall, I think a lot of people on the far right have been so eager to strongly, passionately critique and dismantle CRT that, frankly, if we had spent that much passion and focus trying to dismantle some really horrific racism in our country, maybe this wouldn't even be a conversation right now. So, again, I know that's going to kind of bother some people that I went there, but I sometimes get exhausted by this conversation because I think we can be so eager to critique any CRTer, any CRTian, and make sure they're put in their place and that CRT has no place anywhere, that I just wonder if we spend the same amount of time kind of asking the question, like, Did we allow some really evil things to happen in such a way that it gave space for something like CRT to grow? I don't know if we've been reflective enough in this, that it tends to be just a backlash against the libs, you know? And I'm just saying, I think CRT is an unbiblical ideology at its core, and it's got some serious problems that we're critiquing. I also just wonder if in general Christians had been a little more on the forefront of fighting some racist stuff in our past. And don't get me wrong, that Christians were. I mean, I'm not saying they weren't. I'm just saying a little more on the forefront. I don't know. Would we be in a different place? Would there have even been room for something like CRT to grow?
Right.
Maybe, because we do live in a fallen world and people love false ideologies, so it probably still would have anyway.
Right.
But I just wonder, if Christians had been known strongly in the United States for their fight against racism when we're going through Jim Crow and stuff like that. Would it have been? Maybe not. Something worth considering.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, we've said this too, but it's more helpful. Go talk to someone, right?
Right.
I think we just talk. It's just so easy to talk to people who agree with you and talk about them out there, or to, post out onto social media really towards no one.
Right.
You
it's like,
put on your wall or, go talk to someone. I think there's a time and place to really shut this down.
Mm-hmm.
Like if like my daughter goes to elementary school next year and the first, like their kindergarten teacher is teaching this, like you will see me on the news at one of the school boards.
Right.
You like, there's a time and place, but like, but to your point as well, I think once again, like when we talk about sin, introspection is where we should start.
Yeah, like start with, the log in your own eye.
Yes.
It's just a good, and again, I feel like everything has to be so nuanced. I'm not saying that Christians were not a part of the fight against racism, and I'm not saying that Christians have stood by. I'm just kind of wondering out loud here.
Yeah.
So,
man, do you ever think about you like can't ever run for office now because people are going to pull up these podcasts and then take sound clips of like things you didn't like.
Yep.
They're just going to cut it in a way where like make you say something you didn't say.
Take the word "not" out of my sentence and
right.
Yeah. I'm done. My 8th grade ambitions for being president of the United States are torched. So we talked about the doctrine of creation, that CRT fails to see our shared humanity. We've talked about the doctrine of the fall, that CRT basically fails to see our shared sin, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now time for doctrine of redemption. Critique here is that in CRT, salvation is only for oppressed people, and it's found through social liberation.
Right.
And the oppressors can only essentially get saved through becoming like anti-racist and siding with the oppressed.
Right.
So there's actually very much a works-based salvation in CRT. If you're a part of the oppressed group, you have to work for social liberation. If you're defined as an oppressor, you have to work to become an anti-racist and side with the oppressed. And the other thing I think is there really is no redemption in CRT. There really is no salvation. It's a continual cycle of getting people to overthrow other people.
Yeah. And, something that we did a podcast on race last summer. Well, we had one of our members, Rashawn, on, and something he said will always stick with me. He said, you know what, Daniel? People who are oppressed, all they know how to do is oppress.
Wow.
And I think that's so interesting. And I think it's true. And I think that's what you see, right? And I just think, the gospel message of we're saved from our sins to this eternal peace and unity with the God of the universe is so beautiful. And I just think this, like, all ideologies that fall short of the gospel, which is all of them that's not the gospel,
right?
I just feel like just fall short.
Yeah.
Like, what are you saved
lacking
from? You're saved from this experience, and what are you saved to oppress someone else? I'm like, that's so, like, I feel like even if you hear that, you're like, that's just not very hopeful. Like, what does that give you?
Well, and even, like Paul talks about in Ephesians 2, that in Christ the dividing wall of hostility has been broken down. So, like, the glory of the New Testament church is we have people from every tribe, tongue, language, and nation that used to be at enmity with one another, and now through the gospel have been restored. But if you advocate CRT, what's so interesting, right, is MLK in his I Have a Dream speech, right? He had a dream that little black boys and little white boys, children, right, could sit down at the table of brotherhood together. So his dream was that we would see each other on the content of our character, not the color of our skin.
Right.
That was central to the civil rights movement.
Right.
CRT actually flips that on its head. It says, no, we want to see you by the color of your skin.
Yeah.
And I think it actually makes true brotherhood impossible Because let's say, for example, you're in a local church. You got a black guy, you got a white guy. According to the gospel, you're brothers. You're at the table of brotherhood together.
Yeah.
You should worship together. You should eat together. You should fellowship together, because it's not based on the color of your skin. It's based on Christ, who's brought you together. But on CRT, if you really hold to it, then is the white guy's actions of anti-racism ever going to be enough?
No.
Really? To merit a
you've-
true brotherhood.
And you've already seen that too. I've read these articles where, I've read tweets and stuff where the people who are proponents of this are saying, the anti-racists are our allies, but they're still not us.
Yeah.
Right?
So it's still an us and them. I mean,
Yeah.
again, talking about othering. I mean,
Yeah.
this is like the ultimate othering.
You're still part of the hegemonic power.
You're still in like there's
There's no salvation for them at all.
no.
And salvation for us who hold to this is we get the power, but then what? There's nothing. What's after that?
Right.
You know?
I watched this video that was on Twitter the other day, and it was this guy. It was kind of blasphemous. He basically was trying to turn Jesus into a political revolutionary, which you can go that way a little bit. I mean, I'm fine with that to a certain degree. But then he said, Jesus said, "It is finished," but it's not finished until and he starts listing these things.
Right.
And basically it's CRT.
Right.
I mean, that's blasphemous. But that's what it does, right? It never is finished. Like, the good news of the gospel is it is finished.
Right.
But the bad news of CRT is it's never finished. So it's a work. It's a life void of salvation.
Right.
Especially if you are a part of the so-called oppressor group.
Right.
And there's no way to really experience brotherhood at the table of fellowship together.
Right.
Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision, his dream, is not possible
Right.
with CRT.
Right.
It's not.
And I think really an ideology like this collapses on itself a lot too.
Sure.
And what you see is, for example, like, you still have to hold to that I am oppressed is more important than who's actually in power. And what you see is, for example, like, if for example, like, in 2024, if you have Tim Scott run against Biden, who do you think CRT people are voting for?
Right.
Isn't that interesting?
Yep.
And because Tim Scott is conservative and doesn't hold to CRT, right?
Right.
And I just think it's so interesting that the savior of the 2020 election a lot for CRT was, we have to get this old cisgender white guy Trump out of power and vote in
An old cisgender white guy?
Biden into power. What? You know?
Right.
And so I think that's still like, it does kind of collapse on itself some. It doesn't, it's not very consistent.
It does.
In terms of like who saves you, you know?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, even, and this is kind of a rabbit trail, but if you're a biracial couple, a white guy married to a black girl or vice versa, and so your kid is biracial.
Right.
Which one are they a part of the oppressed group, or are they an oppressor group?
Right.
Like, do they take on their white parents' so-called identity or their black parents' so-called identity?
Right.
And so issues there. So we talked about critique about doctrine of creation is it fails to see our common humanity. Critique on the doctrine of fall is CRT fails to see our common sin. Critique on the doctrine of redemption is that CRT really fails to see our oneness in Christ and fails to offer any kind of salvation. And finally, the doctrine of restoration, we would say, instead of waiting until Christ returns to heal all wounds, we have to throw off the hegemony and establish the new heavens and the new earth here. That's real. The language that's used really is eschatological language.
It is, yeah.
It's, again, we need to work It is not finished. We have to work to establish the new heavens and the new earth. And what the new heavens and the new earth look like, according to CRT, is whatever the dominant group is right now, they must be overthrown and their power must be removed so the oppressed take over power. But then again, repeat. I mean, same thing happens.
And I just think it's funny because the cries for unity come from this crowd a lot, but there's no unity in this. In this ideology. Yeah, there is not. But in the Christian worldview, there is, right? All people of all tribes and nations gather around together and worship the one true God.
Yeah.
Right? We're all one.
Yep.
It's unity.
We're not divided into groups. We're not.
Yeah. And I think as Christians, that's what we should seek is even for someone who holds to this, instead of like, once again, there's a time and place to like, if there's danger, right? There's a time and place to make sure that this doesn't dangerously affect you. But I think in general, it's like we should be trying to tear down the walls of hostility, not creating more walls of hostility.
Right.
And the thing is, and this is the hardest thing about being a Christian, you could be like, well, they're not trying to do that. And I would say because they don't believe Ephesians 2.
Right.
We do.
Right.
And that's probably the hardest thing for me. I've said this a lot. The hardest thing for me about being a Christian is acting like a Christian all the time.
Right.
Because it's so easy for me to be like, that person doesn't do it. Why do I keep having to forgive? They never forgive me. Well, if they're not Christian, they don't believe that. They don't believe that they're forgiven, and they don't believe that they have to forgive.
Yep.
But for me, I'm called to forgive as a Christian. I'm called to tear down the walls of hostility. And that's something we forget a lot as Christians, I think, is that sometimes we're so, especially in the Reform camp, we're so caught up in defending truth that we forget the other parts of being a Christian that we're called to by God.
Good point. Yeah. So CRT with a critique of creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Any closing thoughts?
Man, this has been a doozy of a.
It has. We're a little over an hour, so thanks for sticking with us.
Yeah. We appreciate you guys.
Next week, we will be back to conclude our series on a biblical theology of race with some just kind of random questions. So send them in to us if you have them. info@christfellowshipga.org. We will talk to you next week. Thanks.